So what he basically says is that in summary, 61% of countries currently have a pass or higher score on the index. So at the moment, 61% of countries are actually going to meet the MDGs, which is pretty impressive actually. About 10% or about 15 countries have extremely low scores. And there's about 29% of countries who are doing okay. They're not going to meet the MDGs, but they're not failing appallingly. And then there's about 12% that are absolute stars. We're going to nail the MDGs. Now, I don't have the list of who those are, but I can get them for you because Garth will know. So,
it's in the pre-reads.
Pardon?
It's in the pre-reads.
It's in the pre-reads, that's right. So, I guess one thing for us to be aware of is, there's been a lot of press around the MDGs, how they're going to miss their mark and how they're not going so well, but actually there's some good news stories associated with the MDGs. And I think as we move towards 2015, as we set ourselves up for what comes next, it's actually really important that we also tell a good news story. Because governments don't always want to be associated with things that fail, and they're not going to be interested in renegotiating something post-2015 if all they feel is they're getting hammered over the head for not meeting the pre-existing goals. So I think it's pretty important for us to be thinking about that in our own political framing. I'm not talking about whatever we actually want to achieve, but actually in the political framing of it. So maybe, again, all of this is in the pre-reads, but maybe just to recap, what do we know about the way in which the Millennium Development Goals were first actually brought about? And we heard it again this morning from our panellists. Well, they're actually developed over a 10-year period. We're now talking about 2.5-year period for the post-2015 framework. The MDGs were actually brought together over 10 years. They were, in the end, pretty much drafted by a small team of experts who sat in a room. There was very little consultation, which is actually something that is actually pretty exciting from what I hear this morning and what's in the pre-reads in terms of the different kind of approach that we're talking about taking for 2015. I think the other piece that's really important for us to be cognizant of is that it was a very different political time in our history. We had some very critical leadership. You had Tony Blair, you had Bill Clinton, you had Kofi Annan, all three standing up at very critical times, playing very strong leadership roles into the global context and into their own countries as well. And Bill Clinton's role here in the US was actually pretty critical at that time too, and it'd be interesting to hear Adam's perspective on that. So again, thinking about the political spectrum that we're talking about now, I think good for us to be reflecting on. The other thing that was very different, as we all know, is the economic conditions. Very different economically. Developed countries were much more willing to make increased ODA commitment. There was much more awareness, if you like, much more willingness to be global leaders, to commit more resources. We've had the global financial crisis. We've had parts of Europe in meltdown. We've had even the Asian tigers, the Chinas and so forth, beginning to struggle. That will be a political reality that we will have to grapple with post the MDGs. And again, if we're talking about bringing SDGs and MDGs potentially together, that political reality on top of that economic pressure. So again, that's very different. The MDGs were also largely driven by the North. So fascinatingly, while they were largely imposed on the South, they were largely driven and written by the North. I think we're looking at a very, very different framework this time around. And I can tell you that the developed countries will be quite nervous about that. If we're talking about a framework that has implications for your Australias, your US, your Canadas, as much as it does for your Brazils, your Indias, and your Indonesias, again, a very different political dynamic for us to be thinking about. They've been criticised, the MDGs have been criticised for being reductionist. Yep, they're just a set of very specific goals that leave out a whole range of things. Very reductionist. They're blunt, they're aggregate. They in no way assess the inequality within countries. We've talked a little bit about that. There's no focus or very little focus on sustainability, and for an organisation like World Vision, that should be pretty worrying. We talk about sustainability in our transformational development model all the time. There's an argument to be made, and again, it's in the pre-reads, and I think there's a lot to it, that the MDGs are actually below the minimum requirements set by human rights international law. for those of us who've worked in child rights or human rights for many years, to set standards that are below previously agreed standards by governments is a little worrying. But again, that was the political reality of the time, and I can bet we're moving into an even more complex political era. Again, as I said earlier, they were very focused on action by the South, with only one goal targeted at the North. And again, we've heard this from our panellists, and I think Chris and others have referred to it. The MDGs were all about the what and not much about how at all. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that now as we actually begin to tally up how governments are doing in relation to meeting their MDGs. So that's the negatives, or the things, the lessons, if you like, that we need to be aware of as we stock take the MDGs. The positives that we need to be thinking about potentially as we want to frame up post-2015, they were absolutely galvanizing. You know, you think about many of our countries who are involved in the Make Poverty History campaign, the One campaign, they were incredibly galvanizing for the average, as we would say in Australia, punter. The average person on the street could understand, wrap their head around the Millennium Development Goals, what these things meant. They were galvanising, something to focus on. They were priority setting. Terrific. For the first time, northern governments had at least some kind of mechanism in terms of how they should be focusing or filtering their overseas aid programming. And southern governments were thinking about, we're going to be held accountable for this. We better make sure that we're actually sending or channeling money into some of these key areas. So they certainly had implications for priority setting at the national level, across both the north and the south, I'd suggest. They were clear and simple to understand, nothing complex about them. They were focused, and actually you could monitor them, which is pretty important when you set global goals. You need to be able to monitor them, and they were absolutely able to be monitored. We're seeing that. And again, as I said earlier, from a northern perspective, you could link them to your overseas development program. That's pretty critical, I think, for having an impact in the north. So, lessons learned, things to be aware of, where we're at on the MDGs. Are there any questions or additional reflections before we may move on to that second question? You want to hear any more about the stock take?
That was a great summary. I think just two additional thoughts. One is that goal 8 also wasn't very easily measurable.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to really gain traction in terms of what it actually means. That was a real weakness.
Yeah.
And then, you kind of alluded to this, but I think you had the Millennium Summit, you had the Declaration, which is a very aspirational document. And then later you had the actual targets developed, which didn't necessarily have the same degree of political ownership. And then took another almost 2 or 3 years before there was really a global campaign underway that was able to popularize the goals themselves. And so I think that lag time was a real wasted opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, actually, Adam. It's really good. Two very well made points. The only goal that the North was, engaged in, really, there was absolutely no monitoring or accountability around it. Fascinating, if not unsurprising. And secondly, that it took so long for civil society to get off the ground around how we actually bring about the realisation of the MDGs. So, yeah, both really critical.
And just really quickly, one point about the United States. So clearly, Clinton was a major champion, and I still think will play some kind of role. We'll see.
Yeah, Katie's name filtering in the background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're kind of in a holding pattern because we have this little election around the corner, and I can guarantee you that none of the ads are going to be talking about global development that we get barraged with each and every day. And so, unfortunately, the window to really talk about these issues in the next number of months is limited. But depending on the outcome of the election, I actually am very hopeful that if Obama gets reelected, this could become a real legacy issue for him. He's going to tack toward global issues. He's going to have a lot less pressure to focus and solve some of the domestic ones. There'll still be quite a bit, but not as much. And I could really see this being a perfect role for him. It's a Romney administration. He's going to be very domestically focused. He's going to have lots of pressure not to lead on multilateral issues, and it's going to be a very uphill climb.
Yeah. Good enough.
Yeah, I think the result of the stock taking rather makes the post-MDG conversation more urgent. Because even for the 61% who are on track, the existence of inequalities are worrying. Now, my question is there any lessons of the process of the MDG formulation, if you like, that could be useful in our current process?
Yeah, I think there are a few. One that we've heard about is that whatever replaces, if anything replaces, the MDGs, the process should be more inclusive of civil society and a broader spectrum of people, and that will actually help the outcome. So that's one thing, and that, as I hear the panelists speaking, is a very deliberate realisation and a very deliberate investment by, whether it's the UN, who knows what national governments will do. That will be a different conversation as to how engaged they are with their civil societies in any given context, I suspect. But certainly from a UN perspective, they're very open to that consultation process. I think the other piece that's pretty critical also is, and again the panellists talked about it this morning, not just providing the what, but at least giving some sense of the how. And again, I think there's real merit in World Vision thinking about what role we play in supporting, whilst not replacing governments, in that how piece. Dan?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that tension between the what and how, actually. And I appreciate your comment on the simplicity of the current MDG framework and how that aids the process of its acceptability, actually, as our being able to implement it. But it is that. It is about the what. It's certainly not about the how. Kate and I could talk about what it took in health to see actual action, which was way beyond the MDGs. It wasn't until multiple stakeholders stepped forward many years after the MDG came out to say, look, this is going nowhere. There needs to be a how component here. And we have multiple initiatives that we started to actually see action. But I'm not sure that the MDG framework could have addressed the how, because it's so complex, actually. I mean, that is a big, big mandate. So I think its simplicity was very useful.
Denise, and then Amanda.
I've gone completely blank. Sorry.
Amanda, then I've got Sharon, and I've got Pia.
My point's just on the simplicity and the how, just building on that. I honestly don't think if you hadn't have included the how, you would have got the MDGs. Not just because of complexity, because at that stage of us, and still now, we're still grappling with the how, and we will continue to. But start to prescribe the how, and you won't get the US or China agreeing at this stage. So we have to keep in mind, I think we need to understand what our position on how would be. But if we start to think we could write that into whatever, or that the UN can even write that into the framework, the political challenges we face now are going to get even.
And I think the panelists referred to not being too prescriptive. What I do think, Amanda, is we could challenge ourselves to think about toolkits and those kind of things that you can provide that are useful in, I mean, we're dealing with toolkits all the time. We give them to, or engage with national governments around the concept of toolkits. I don't think there's something in the how, but I agree entirely that the politics behind the how are fraught.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'd add to that is if we also want to, because I know one of the concerns that keeps coming up is only one of the MDGs applied to the north. If we plan to campaign heavily on making these universal, the likelihood of an outcome is going to be very, very slim. So we actually do have to make a political call on if that's something we think worth campaigning for.
Excuse me, on that point, I think it's not a bad point in terms, it depends on which level we're speaking. Because if we're speaking on a higher level, that might be a problem. But it's at the national level we speak that we need to see the hows and make observatories. That can be our strength as a civil society. So it doesn't necessarily, what is a challenge in one level, do not necessarily is a challenge in another one. So I think that leads us to different strategies in different areas.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the stocktake, what they didn't mention this morning is inequality actually got worse in most countries during the MDG period. So child mortality in the poorest households has actually got worse than the richest. So you've seen national averages, but you've also seen inequality get bigger. And I think that's the picture that we need to be addressing.
Hence why you feel that theme becoming such a big focus. Yeah.
And just Tanis from World Vision Canada. Thanks. I guess that plays to your point in terms of fragile states. If 10% or 15 of these countries are failing, they're fragile states.
Not a single fragile state.
Maybe
but single
any of the MDGs, right? So what is it that within fragile states that the SDGs, if that goes, will bring to that context to have success? And if not, do fragile states need a different way of operating, and brings in the complexity issues?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we really need to grapple with as an organization, and I was just listening to all the discussion about the simplicity of the MDGs, and I think that only in a room full of advocacy people could that be like an agreed point. and that most of the world actually for years found the MDGs really quite confusing and hard to remember and hard to understand how they could possibly be connected to those goals. So yeah, it was really, really difficult, and that's actually where Make Poverty History came from, right? Was a reaction to how actually complex the MDG goals were. And I think some of the discussion in the earlier panel about having lost the connection to the values behind those goals in the early years, and maybe all the years except maybe the last 5 of the MDG process, is for me a real learning as a communicator, and I'd hate to see us lose the values behind the setting of the goals that come next, because it's that value piece that people really connect with. And I think we actually have to get simpler than we were with the MDGs.
Yeah, and one of the things I think also we could learn from the current set of MDGs is that the way they have been entered into the political debates, as we were struggling to meet them anyway, it became quite clear, at least to the uninformed observer like myself, that this was about reducing the number of poor countries instead of reducing the number of people in poverty. And I think that is an important lesson to learn for the next framework. It's not about reducing the number of poor countries, it is about reducing the number of people living in poverty.
I think Catherine made that point right there in their fabulous briefing paper too. Yeah. Denise?
Yes, I think I remember it now. One of the lessons learned I saw from one of the many papers that I really sent us, which I thought was useful, was the fact that the architects of the MDGs set the goals on the basis of the trajectory they anticipated around development, social and economic development. So they weren't setting goals that were beyond the reach.
They were not unrealistic goals.
They're not unrealistic goals. They're on the basis of what they saw would happen anyway. And I wondered what that means for what is the likely approach that might be taken this time around in a very different environment. So I think that is something that we need to look out for in terms of understanding the trajectory and how that could possibly influence some of the decisions around the next set of MDGs.
Yes, one of the things that I would like this group to recall, we quite often talk about how the MDGs were put together, and that it was mainly a desk exercise by a group of high technical experts putting this set of goals together. But one of the documents that informed that work was the Children Agenda, a world fit for children.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the unfinished business of MDGs, I think the Children Agenda, a world fit for children, must be on top of that unfinished business. So I think this is something that we should recapture, and maybe that could be one of our messaging that we should advocate for, because that is very key. I mean, they talk about how the MDGs were informed by the Women's Conference, by the International Youth Year, by the Rio Plus, the original Rio Conference, and so on. But one of the main ones, and which is why we have 2 MDGs which are directly involving children, is a World Fit for Children. So this year is the 10th anniversary of a World Fit for Children. It has gone unnoticed, even by the UN. Here in Advocacy and Justice and here in New York, we have been trying to remind everyone that there is that children agenda there, that it has been completely unfinished. Now, if we go back to that agenda, when a World Fit for Children was approved, it was based on the premise that the previous children agenda was an unfinished business. So here we are 20 years ago, from the very first children agenda, and we continue with a long list of unfinished business for children. So I think that should be like in the core of our thinking and on the messages, and remind the international community on that.
Okay. Can I draw a line under stop tape? Okay. So then I have two just little questions I think I was going to grapple in 2 minutes. Is that right?
Give you 7.
The first one was, and I don't know how you want to handle this, Chris, but policy making by committee can be interesting. But what do we think about the current MDG goals, and should they be replaced? I think that was one of the questions we wanted to actually at least surface some perspectives on, if not actually establish well visions policy. What do people think? Should we replace them? Should we continue them? I think in one of the pre-res I had a look at, there were 3 suggested scenarios which I thought made quite good sense, which were keep what we've got, add a couple, completely replace. So maybe we'll just leave those other 2 in terms of what we think about the other 2. But as a starting point, do we think that as an organisation we should remain focused on the current MDGs?
Well, if the scenario is keep what you got, but just extend the deadline, then it's admitting defeat, right? So personally, but of course, everybody can have their own personal opinion. Keep what we've got is not an option.
Right. So we vote for no. Other perspectives?
I don't know. One thing is, I really love change. So at what point change is useful if we replace everything we've done before? I think we need to build on what we've done and what we achieved, and then rethink that process and rethink the way to be more practical, more clear, and more simple. In terms of measuring, in terms of data, in terms of project. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not saying necessarily not to rethink the process, but I'd rather think about it than in the areas, because the areas are always more diffuse, you say, and the process is something we can control at the end.
So thinking more about the how and less about the what.
Exactly.
Thank you. I'm also of the view of worrying about the how, and I'm of the view of honoring a process. But I also think a lot hinges on language, and I think maybe we should think about what we mean when we talk about post-MDGs or post-2015. Is it a post that leaves them behind? Is it a post that adds to what we already have and builds on the lessons learned from that process, which in itself has some merits, as we just discussed? So, of course, I'm of the second view. I think that throwing them away is not an option, but also just extending the deadline is not an option either. It would be for me a failure scenario. I guess somewhere in between is a good idea.
Other perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I like the notion of enhanced Millennium Development Goals, because I feel like too much political will has been built to simply just throw it out. And obviously we haven't achieved the existing targets, so I think we need to build on them and not simply extend them. Where I have trouble though, and this is where I struggle, is if you look at the original Millennium Declaration, there's beautiful language in there about the goal of making globalization work for the poorest and most vulnerable. And I think that's where the Millennium Development Goal targets and overall processes fail the most. So I feel like there's an opportunity as we enhance and revise the MDGs to figure out how do you reset them so that we can actually get to the most vulnerable and marginalized, which is going to require quite a bit of change in the way in which this has been executed.
But I'm going to say it comes potentially
So,
down to the how.
It does come down to the how, and I know that's much more politically fraught, which I agree, and it's much more complicated, but I feel like we can have a convergence between, you know, this enhanced perspective with a little bit more rigor around how do we reach the most marginalized. And if we got those two things to converge, we would have a end product that I actually think is better than what we have now.
Right.
I'll take the position, I think I really like the way that was framed, but I'll take the position for the sake of kind of how I you know, my view on the world, that I think we should try very hard for a completely new dynamic. The government of Botswana recently hosted an event in Botswana with African heads of state, and many came, in which they said, you know, corporate balance sheets don't make any sense anymore. The way we actually conceptualize profit and loss and expenses doesn't take into effect, for example, biodiversity in our countries. And what happens when a corporation comes in and is very successful, but actually, you know, 4 or 5 species are severely impacted, or our water ecosystems are, you know, you can just, lots of ways you can describe that. So a lot of very nuanced thinking is occurring in a way that wasn't even a discussion point 15 years ago about how we actually define success with our for-profit entities going forward. So there are new things that are just part of the narrative now that weren't part of the narrative. We have extraordinary wealth, if you will, in terms of 5 billion small computers in people's pockets around the world. 5 billion small computers in people's pockets wasn't even a concept, you know, 10, 15 years ago. So again, another measure, another you know, way in which engagement can occur that wasn't even, I guess it was conceptualized back then, but it wasn't a reality. So I think that very good effort should be made to leverage, you know, kind of what's there. Of course, not throw it out, but move it forward, accelerate it forward, and then to reflect upon, okay, as Hillary Clinton said, was in Busan, South Korea, where that meeting takes place. She said, you know, we the UN, we the U.S. government, we the other governments of the world, we're becoming a smaller and smaller piece of the actual global trade of goods and services. That's just happening. So how do we again factor that into what kind of world we have and what kind of world is moving forward? And I'll just throw out something for our consideration. Maybe this has already been done by the sort of the thinking kind of intelligentsia, which Advocacy, Justice, and you know, that's kind of who you are for us. You're our R&D in a sense, in a profound sense. I don't know if this is possible, but it would be nice to have sort of an agreement on how things are right now, because if you, depending on which reports you read, the world is like really doing badly, poorly, while the world is really getting better. And we all kind of use the statistics.
Both of those could probably be
and
true,
both are
depending
true.
on how you use your stats.
You know, Fareed Zacharias spoke to Harvard graduates a few weeks ago, and he said the world is profoundly at peace. If you ask people that study the history of the world, we are actually profoundly at peace right now. He said, you know, the UN system has said we've made progress in development and poverty reduction in the last 50 years greater than the last 500 years in the aggregate. And yes, there's other stuff that's climate change, and there's, you know, fragile states. All the statistics are bad for those fragile states. But so how do we, which set of facts, which set of large, what are the large narratives that we say, you know what, for us, for right now, this is sort of the information that we're going to work with so that we can develop our frameworks, our approach to this in a way that anybody looking at it will say, well, okay, that was the basis upon which we went forward.
So potentially on your frameworks. Denise, and then Gerard.
then in mine is less about the framework, but the underpinnings of the framework. I think what for me is a big concern is that what took 10 years to arrive as a consensus should not be thrown out, but should be built upon. And so the process needs to reestablish those foundations for us to then go to the new level. And I agree with Frank that we do live in a very different world than we did when the MDGs were drafted. But it's precisely, but in some ways, human nature and the foundations remain the same. And so I really believe that World Vision should, if we face a solid foundation, should advocate for building on that foundation as we look at the new set of goals.
Dan, did you have your hand up earlier? Then you put it down again?
I did, but I mean, I'm really enjoying listening to everybody. I guess I agree with enhance, but perhaps my caution would be that we need to be very careful about understanding what works from the current MDG framework and why it works. It is a set of indicators. Indicators are very useful to catalyze action because they translate into accountability. When governments include, we've seen it over and over again, when governments proactively include actual indicators in their plans, change starts to happen. And that's what the MDGs have given us globally. It's worked quite well. I think we should enhance it. But I don't think that we should pretend that it's something that it's not either. On the how question with equality, I think equality is extremely important for the next generation in MDGs. It's natural evolution in a way. I like to distinguish between that as a how, because you refer to it as a how question, and what I think about a how in terms of how. How, to me, is the aid frameworks, how the financing is happening, how bilaterals and governments are prioritizing their ODAs, etc. That's more how those action plans. This is still, inequality to me is still a what issue. It's the next important issue.
Or, and I'll talk about this maybe when I do a wrap up of this, but it's potentially a lens, which gives a bit of. So, Sharon.
Yeah, as I'm listening to this, one of the things that stops me from having a a meltdown about how much there is to tackle as an organization is we're actually not on the hook for redeveloping the entire framework. What we're on the hook for is what our input is into the development of that framework. So, and I know that you have to think about the whole framework to do that, but one of the things that when Frank was talking really struck me is around the way we accept nations measure, the kind of spreadsheets they use, their statements of success or failure. And I think that if we can do one thing well as an organization is that we can insist that a measure of a well-being of a nation or the success of a development goal has to be measured at least in part by the well-being of the poorest children in that equation. And if we can make that point throughout this process, I think that however the larger framework falls, if we can make that piece of success in our interventions, then we'll have done a really, I think, great thing in the process.
Yes, kind of piggybacking on what Dan, you said what was right with the MDGs, or maybe looking at what was wrong with the MDGs, and so why do we need some new SDGs or MDGs? If it's political, then that it's political, the MDGs have ended and now we need to do something new, then our advocacy will look very different in how we engage. Or are we taking the perspective that there were problems with the MDGs, and where is it that we're going to improve conceptually on them? Where are the gaps that we've seen? Were there issues in the targets? What are those targets? And having that type of discussion. So it's even deciding, I think, as a group, is it something political that we're going to be engaging on, or is it we've actually found some fault which you listed quite nicely, that those negative aspects of the MDGs, and we want to advocate for changes in those areas.
So maybe to draw a line under this conversation, just to pull together some of it. The idealist in me gravitates straight to framing. So let's just throw out, because they're so flawed, let's just start new. The realist and sort of the politician in me says, ain't gonna happen. There's absolutely no way I can imagine the governments of today in the current climate negotiating and agreeing a new framework. To Sharon's point, beautifully made, we don't have to worry about that in some ways, but in a very different perspective, we should care about that, I think. And I think we should care about whether or not they seek to enhance it with something worse, or they seek to enhance it with something that whittles down what we already have. So I do think we need a perspective, even though we're not accountable for coming up with the frameworks. I think it's good for the organisation to have some sort of considered view on it. I tend to Adam's perspective, which is the enhanced view, to be honest. And partly because I think the world has changed in the last decade, and sticking just with the 8 we've got probably won't be adequate for the next decade. To your point, Dan, I also wonder about how we use lenses, or how we bring in the notion of lenses into the construct of the goals. So you think about inequality, whether or not there's a whole new goal around inequality, or whether or not inequality should actually inform the way we understand each of the goals and whatever is added to that goal. And I don't know exactly how you do that, although potentially it's in the how. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can consider inequality, or any of the other 9 things that I think are currently on the table, and potentially up to 12 or 13. Chris, I don't know how A and JC are going to take this forward, but I think you've heard the variety of perspectives in the room. One thing I would say, depending on what the perspective is, and I do think we need a perspective as an organisation, it potentially informs what we think about how we tackle that other question that I talked about, which is what do we do with focusing on the current MDGs as we move towards the post? Because if we're talking about a brand new framework, then it becomes very complex for an organisation, I think, to hold that intention or say, we want to keep going forward on what we've got to meet these commitments, but hey, we think it's so forward, we think we need to come up with something else. I think that's a real tension for us, but if that's how we determine to go, then let's think about that. If we're talking about enhancement, I think it does make that focus on the current probably more, we're able to do it in a different way, and Frank, feel free to challenge me on that. Aussies love a good challenge. But I think there's a potential there for us to be able to hold those two more together.
Yeah, just a point, because I think in terms of Frank's black and white MDG work, I think that we can use also that in another area of what and why help in terms of impact and results. Because one of the things on the what I'm thinking, not in terms of the proper MDGs, but what as program, and why? Because people care at the end of the day. So I think it's important to see the emotional side also in the terms of the communication. I mean, why we should speak about failure is a learning process. So in that sense, I mean, how can we think about a strategy in terms of communication that we are building change in terms of a learning process? And to be honest, if the kids of the communities are able to play with each MDG and know what they are, I will be quite happy with that. Maybe they won't change the health systems or the local, but if they already got that in their minds with games, that's a really good impact. Maybe it's not a result yet, but I think it's important to leverage the idea of what we want to impact and which are the results also in terms of thinking about the world vision perspective for the post-2018.
That's a good point. And then I really need to check with the boss to see how you want, because I've actually gone over the time allotted by it.
Yeah, one of the differences I was thinking related to how the process was done before and now is the fact that for many years, the knowledge and awareness about the existence of MDGs was an elite. Even in World Vision, I remember in Latin America in 2004, we wanted to frame our strategy around the MDGs and it didn't pass in World Vision.
Chris and I were talking about this earlier.
I know.
We should debate it. Should we join that poverty history?
No, then we came with the big goals. It had nothing to do with the MDGs, and it's only later that we started to do this. Anyway, that's how things go. the reason why I want to bring that, and I want to connect with what Fernanda was saying, you know, in thinking with Felipe about how to do the guidelines for children and youth and how to engage them. The starting point is that there are 8 MDGs, you know, that there needs to be a linkage between this process that has not finished yet.
Yes.
And how is it that children and youth and communities, especially the poorest, are experiencing in their lives access to health or education or gender equality? And from there, what are the gaps in the issues that are still in their own perception and reality not completed? And therefore bridge that process to what needs to happen next, you know, and what are the unfinished business and what will have to be enhanced, therefore, you know. So I think making this linkage is extremely important. And because the opportunity today, not only because there is you know, stronger civil society, but also because of the technology, and also because we have a new generation of children and youth who will spread the word, there will be more awareness in the masses, if you will, about what is this that ultimately connects with their lives, you know, and their well-being. So because of this new reality and the possibilities to take this from an elite group of NGOs, governments, and UN to the masses, that has tremendous, profound implitions. On then thinking about how to link that to what could and needs to come later on in terms of how people perceive their well-being and their lives, you know, areas in their lives that are not being met by what currently exists. I don't know if I'm
That's
making
great.
sense.
No, any
But,
good strategy
you know,
has a learning review, and you're talking about learning
exactly,
where we're up
and
to
then
before we
linking
move
it to
forward.
it, you know, yes.
Very sound.